Imagine you are a medieval peasant, hungry and weak, trying to survive the worst crisis the world has ever known. The streets are empty, the markets undersupplied, and the Black Death decimates anyone who dares leave their home. What is left for you to eat? Bread, the staple food that everyone consumes. But this bread is no longer what you knew. It's moldy, filled with rotten grains, and in some cases, even with worms. What would it be like if instead of nourishing your body, this food became your greatest enemy? This is the cruel reality of contaminated black bread, poison disguised as food, which not only sustained but also killed many during the Black Death. Food scarcity during the Black Death was one of the most desperate conditions faced by the medieval population. Arable lands were ravaged, harvests destroyed by the plague, and death spread everywhere. And in the midst of this chaos, bread, which had always been the basic food, the daily sustenance, became a symbol of tragedy. The truth is, without the resources to produce quality flour, bread began to be made from deteriorated grains. Healthy wheat, which normally served for the production of soft and nutritious breads, was in short supply. Harvests were meager, and with the death of so many farmers, farms were practically deserted. Instead, bakers began to use contaminated cereals, rotten grains, mold, and in some cases, even leftovers of other foods that were starting to spoil. These contaminated grains not only tasted terrible, but were also fertile ground for fungi and bacteria. Mold, a type of microscopic fungus, proliferated in the damp and low-quality conditions in which the bread was made. Often this moldy bread was the only food available, consumed with the hope that it would be enough to quell hunger. But what no one knew, or perhaps no one wanted to believe, was that eating this moldy bread was more like poison disguised as food. Ingesting these fungi was not limited to causing a simple upset stomach. It led to food poisoning, severe digestive problems, and in extreme cases, death. Mold in bread could contain aflatoxins, highly toxic substances that compromised the immune system, making victims more susceptible to the plague and other diseases. For peasants whose bodies were already weakened by hunger and lack of medical care, moldy bread became a slow death sentence. And it wasn't just mold that contaminated the bread. Rotten grains were often infested with worms. Small worms, which had fed on the grains, were inside the bread, visible only to the most attentive eyes. Even if the bread was cooked at high temperatures, these worms could still survive in small quantities. Many had no other option but to eat this bread, as there was no other source of sustenance. Eating moldy and worm-infested bread was therefore a necessary evil. But the price to pay was high. The continuous intake of these contaminated foods further weakened the body's defenses, and the situation only worsened. As the Black Death spread, and the bodies of thousands of victims accumulated in the streets, the need for survival became even more desperate. But bread, even in its most lethal form, was a familiar food, a constant in a crumbling world. In times of despair, people often ignored the signs that the bread was, in fact, poisoned. The unpleasant smell, the mold-stained appearance, the crawling worms, all of this was ignored, as the simple act of eating was the only way to try to face imminent death. But as the plague raged, there was no escaping the fact that black bread, with all its dangers, was doing its dirty work. It not only nourished, but also spread diseases, especially among the already debilitated. For those on the front lines of the disease, like peasants and urban workers, black bread became a symbol of collective suffering. It was everywhere, on the tables of poor families, in taverns, on deserted streets, and no one was safe. With the few available foods, hopelessness took hold. The choice between eating rotten bread or starving to death became harder each day. This bread, which in normal times represented survival, now represented slow and painful death. For many, it was no longer a symbol of life, but of an existence consumed by pestilence. The impact of this contaminated black bread on the medieval population cannot be underestimated. Diseases caused by the ingestion of these rotten foods, the weakening of the body, and increased vulnerability to the Black Death, formed a vicious cycle of death. While bread remained the basis of their diet, it was also contributing to the destruction of those who consumed it. And even when the plague finally began to subside, the effect of this contaminated food lingered, with the memory of the deaths it caused still very vivid in the minds of survivors. Reflecting on this dark chapter of history, we can understand the depth of the medieval tragedy. Bread, which should have been a symbol of sustenance, became a poison, a silent weapon against a population already fighting an immortal enemy, the Black Death. And so what began as a basic food ended up becoming one of the biggest contributors to a slow and cruel death. But what happened after the Black Death? How did humanity learn to avoid such food tragedies? These questions lead us to reflect on the limits of human survival, the strength of adaptation, and the immense sacrifice that was necessary to emerge from the abyss of medieval death. The Black Death was not only a health threat, but a destructive force that attacked every aspect of medieval life. When the epidemic spread like wildfire across Europe, the population was already weakened by decades of famine, wars, and scarcity. But the impact of the plague didn't stop there. One of the most devastating consequences was the mass death of animals, which left many peasants without one of the most essential sources of food, meat. But in a world where death seemed constant, peasants found themselves forced to make unthinkable decisions to try to survive. When animals began to die in large numbers due to the plague, many resorted to a deadly food, the meat of dead animals, already in the process of decomposition. This was one of the darkest moments in medieval history, when the struggle for survival led humans to consume foods that at first glance would be unthinkable. The scene was terrifying. Fields once fertile and full of life were now empty, and the herds of cattle, pigs, and sheep that once provided sustenance were falling dead, victims of the plague, hunger, or diseases associated with the epidemic. Peasants then found themselves facing a dilemma: die of hunger or consume what was left, even the carcasses of their own animals. For them, the simple act of eating, of ingesting something that could provide them with energy, became a matter of life or death. The problem with meat from dead animals was more serious than peasants could imagine. When animals died, their bodies began to decompose rapidly. Putrid meat, which initially would be a source of protein, was contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and toxins. For a body already weakened by hunger, lack of nutrients, and disease, consuming this decaying meat was a slow death sentence. The meat began to deteriorate from the inside out, becoming a broth of bacteria and toxic substances that, when ingested, caused severe food poisoning. The putrefaction of animal carcasses was rapid. In the humid and warm climate of many places in medieval Europe, decomposition accelerated, meaning that in just a few hours, the meat was infested with a variety of microorganisms, such as Clostridia and other bacteria, that proliferated in environments conducive to decomposition. People who consumed this infected meat frequently suffered from diarrhea, intense vomiting, fever, and abdominal pain, classic symptoms of food poisoning. But contaminated meat was not just an immediate risk. Parasites present in the bodies of dead animals, such as worms and larvae, passed to the humans who consumed them, causing a series of parasitic diseases. Furthermore, by digesting the meat of plague-infected animals, many people were in fact exposing themselves to the same bubonic plague bacterium, already present in the carcasses of peasants and animals. Thus the meat, that should have offered sustenance, ended up becoming one of the greatest agents for the spread of the disease. Still, the decision to consume rotten meat was made out of sheer necessity. In the desperation to stay alive, people looked at what was left of their fallen herds and saw only one thing: a potential source of food. The fear of hunger was by far more palpable than the certainty that the meat was contaminated. For many, the choice seemed simple: either eat the rotten meat and try to survive, or succumb to death by starvation. But the ingestion of putrid meat was not the only consequence of animal deaths. Peasants also faced the dilemma of what to do with the carcasses. Many tried everything to preserve the meat: salting, sun-drying, or even smoking. But in many cases, these attempts were futile. Heat and humidity accelerated decomposition, and the meat quickly became a broth of bacteria, a true biological time bomb, ready to further devastate the population. As the plague spread, the consumption of rotten meat became increasingly common. Families who had no other source of protein and were desperate to feed their children found themselves forced to resort to the meat of dead animals, which in some cases were found in an advanced state of decomposition, already smelling strongly and covered in worms. For them, the fact that this meat could kill them seemed irrelevant, since without it, death by hunger was an even crueler certainty. Moreover, with the death of animals and the collapse of agricultural production, villages began to face another crisis: the lack of milk, eggs, and other vital products for daily nutrition. The meat of dead animals then became the only option for those who wanted to maintain some form of resistance to the plague and hunger. However, the consequences of consuming rotten meat extended far beyond simple food poisoning. Those who survived the poisoning caused by the rotten meat were often so weakened that they became easy prey for other diseases. Rotten meat also created an environment conducive to the rise of other epidemics, as the accumulation of decaying animal carcasses created a kind of vicious cycle of contamination, attracting more parasites, flies, and other pests that spread even more germs. It was an era of absolute despair, where human life seemed to be an endless tragedy. Peasants who survived the plague were constantly exposed to impossible choices. Eating rotten and contaminated meat was a desperate gamble. But in a time when resources were scarce and death loomed, survival often became a matter of making any possible decision, no matter how deadly. And so, amidst the putrid meat of dead animals and the remnants of a life that was falling apart, the plague continued to spread. Peasants, in an insane effort to combat hunger and disease, found themselves consuming foods that, ironically, were responsible for accelerating their death. In a time when even bread and water were contaminated, the meat of dead animals was one of the last sources of food for many, but also one of the main responsible for the expansion of the disease. As the plague advanced, taking with it the majority of the European population, the act of eating became, for many, one of the greatest dilemmas of existence. Eating meant surviving, but it also meant risking one's life. And this was the cruel reality of the Black Death: survival was not guaranteed, and the available food options were as dangerous as the death that surrounded them. In the suffocating heat of a Europe dominated by the Black Death, villages faced an unprecedented crisis. What was once a daily routine of cultivation, trade, and simple life was now a desperate struggle for survival. People were dying of hunger, disease, and fear, and any type of food, even the most dangerous, was treated as a precious commodity. Among the many tragedies that marked this dark era, one stands out for its brutality and the daring choice made by peasants: the slaughtering of diseased pigs. Imagine an isolated village, its humble stone and wooden houses, with deserted streets, except for those few brave souls who still risked venturing out in search of food. The scene is desolate. The fields are empty, animals are dying in large numbers, and the plague is reaping lives at every corner. Herds of pigs, once a source of sustenance for families, were now being slaughtered, not for their healthy meat, but because they were infested with disease. The pigs, many of them infected with the same plague that decimated human populations, were being killed, and in some villages, these diseased animals were the only source of available meat. The decision to consume the meat of diseased pigs seemed unthinkable, but in reality, for those on the verge of starvation, it was an inevitable choice. The fear of hunger was as great as the fear of the plague. In fact, the worse of the two evils seemed to be death by starvation, and so, the villagers, in their desperate struggle for survival, made a decision as drastic as it was dangerous to slaughter and consume the diseased pigs, which were at the height of their putrefaction. The situation was alarming. The pigs slaughtered by their families were severely ill, frequently infected with the same bacteria and pathogens that caused the plague. Even so, the peasants, already weak and out of options, did not hesitate to cut the meat from these animals and use it for food. The meat, of course, was in an advanced state of decomposition, with the fat becoming liquid and the fetid smell of rot pervading the air. The meat that should have nourished was, in fact, turning into a true contamination bomb. The meat of diseased pigs was not only unfit for consumption due to its unbearable taste and smell, it was full of pathogens that could be fatal to humans. The conditions of the animals' deaths created an environment conducive to the growth of harmful bacteria, such as salmonella and other bacteria that cause severe food infections. The decomposition process accelerated the proliferation of bacteria, making the meat even more dangerous as time passed. But for those who were desperate and with food stocks already depleted, this contaminated meat was the only option. Imagine the scene: villagers, with their pale faces and trembling hands, cutting the meat from pigs that were far from healthy. Some tried, unsuccessfully, to remove the visibly decaying parts, but the truth is, there wasn't much they could do. The meat was already impregnated with a lethal bacterial load. Those who had no other food available then cooked the meat, often in soups or stews, trying somehow to mask the nauseating taste and unbearable smell. But none of this could eliminate the damage caused by the bacteria, which were still present in the meat, no matter how much it was cooked. The process of slaughtering, where pigs were sacrificed to take advantage of what little meat remained, was a macabre practice. Peasants not only butchered infected animals, but found themselves forced to live with the constant threat that what they were consuming could be the cause of their own death. With each piece of meat consumed, they risked infection. To make matters even worse, hygiene conditions were precarious, and knowledge about contamination and disease spread was almost non-existent. The meat was contaminated, and the preparation environment was unsafe. Infection, therefore, was practically guaranteed. Still, many peasants managed to survive, at least temporarily, by consuming contaminated meat. But the question was, how long could the body last? Even if the meat from diseased pigs provided much-needed protein, it came at a high price. Symptoms of food poisoning were frequent: abdominal pain, diarrhea, and vomiting. Those who managed to resist these symptoms continued to live, but were weakened, becoming easy prey for the plague. The immune systems of many peasants were so compromised by hunger and the ingestion of contaminated food that they could not fight against the plague bacterium. Thus, the meat that should have helped them survive was in reality undermining their chances of living. In many cases, the consumption of infected pig meat resulted in a rapid spread of the plague. Contaminated meat, when consumed, accelerated infection and made peasants more susceptible to contact with the plague agent. The meat was in a state of decomposition, carrying with it the same plague pathogens, and this proximity to the disease meant that those who ate the dead pigs became, in effect, an extension of the problem. And it wasn't just pig meat that was at stake. Other dead animals, such as oxen, cows, and even birds, were also consumed, in a desperate effort not to succumb to hunger. But infected pig meat stood out for its abundance. Pigs were more common, and therefore more easily accessible to peasants. But the price of consuming this meat could not be ignored. It was a ticking time bomb for those who depended on it for survival. The sacrifice of diseased pigs for consumption was rooted in the idea that any food was better than hunger. But in fact, this tragic choice shows us how far human beings can be pushed by their need to survive. The practice of eating meat from plague-contaminated animals was one of many difficult choices made by peasants, who knew that the risk of death was great, but the possibility of survival seemed even more uncertain without this resource. These survival stories, though difficult to imagine, are a reflection of a time when human life was constantly at risk and where each day lived was a battle against death, not only from disease, but also from food scarcity. The slaughtering of diseased pigs and the consumption of decaying meat are symbols of a greater tragedy, where the struggle for life, no matter how cruel, led human beings to make desperate decisions that in the end only made the suffering even more intense. In a world devastated by the Black Death, where streets were filled with bodies and death loomed over every village, survival became a matter of resilience and adaptation. Hunger was as common as the plague, and peasants, with their already fragile and exhausted lives, faced a constant battle against food scarcity. When scarce grains finally became available, they were often moldy, infested with fungi, and contaminated, yet they were the only viable option for food. Porridge from repurposed grains, a simple mixture of boiled cereals, became one of the most consumed foods during the crisis. However, this porridge, which was the last hope for many to survive, came with a bitter and lethal price. Imagine a medieval village, where the gray, gloomy, cloud-laden sky reflected the desperation of the population. The harvests, once abundant and sustaining, had failed due to the plague and famine, and the land was completely exhausted. There was no more pure wheat, no healthy barley, no fresh rice. What remained were moldy, rotten, and insect-infested grains. But for the peasants, these grains were precious. Each seed, each piece of rotten cereal, was carefully separated and stored, as it was the only resource to try to feed a population already debilitated by hunger and disease. The process of repurposing these grains began when families collected the remains of seeds that could still be used for consumption. Although these grains were visibly contaminated, often moldy or damaged by worms, there was no choice. To survive, anything edible had to be used. So the grains were boiled in large pots, turning into porridges and soups that were consumed by both adults and children, who were among the most vulnerable. This repurposed grain porridge did not taste appetizing. In fact, its taste was almost unbearable. The texture was heavy, thick, and the pungent smell of mold spread as the mixture boiled over the fire. But, in the end, it was that or nothing. The remaining food was not made to please, but to keep stomachs full, even if temporarily. For those who managed to swallow the soup or porridge, the relief was momentary. No matter how much the smell and taste made them cough and wince, there was no alternative. However, the cost of consuming these moldy and contaminated grains was extremely high. When boiling the grains, the heat could kill some of the visible bacteria and parasites, but not enough to eliminate all risks. The mold present in the grains contained toxic substances called aflatoxins, which could not be dissipated by heat. Aflatoxins were extremely harmful to the liver and digestive system. Over time, the consumption of these contaminated grains caused serious digestive diseases. Constant diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal pain were common symptoms for those who ate this porridge. Many, especially children and the elderly, succumbed to dehydration and weakness caused by these diseases. But the problem didn't stop there. Moldy grains were also often infested with microscopic parasites that fed on the cereal. Even boiling the porridge, these parasites could survive and infect humans. Some peasants reported feeling something strange in their stomachs after consuming the porridges, a sensation of tingling and cramps, as if something was moving inside them. The infestation of worms and other intestinal parasites made the villagers' conditions even more severe, creating a vicious cycle of malnutrition and parasitic diseases. Furthermore, grains were not the only problem. The soil where these cereals grew was contaminated by the presence of the plague and other pathogens. Even grains that apparently were not moldy were subject to bacterial contamination. Insect pests that infested the once fertile fields were now common in all meals and were considered one of the worst health threats. Peasants who prepared the porridge were in fact consuming not only the cereal, but also the larvae and eggs of the worms that infested these grains, further exacerbating health problems. The effect of these contaminated foods was devastating for the already fragile population. The bodies of the peasants, already exhausted by hunger, plague, and the effort to try to survive, did not have enough resistance to cope with the effects of the toxins in the grains. In many cases, moldy and infested grain porridge not only caused severe diseases, but also further weakened the immune system of those who consumed it. This made people more susceptible to the plague, making them easy prey for the disease that decimated their families. But the most tragic thing of all was that, despite all these risks, there was no better option. For those who were still alive, this porridge was all that remained. There was no more fresh meat, vegetables, or other types of food available. Market exchanges were practically impossible, as many villages were isolated, with roads blocked by the fear of contamination. For those on the verge of dying from hunger, porridge was an alternative that, even if harmful, was reluctantly accepted, as it meant the difference between living one more day or succumbing to starvation. This scenario of hopelessness only worsened as the plague advanced. Repurposed grain porridge, despite being the last option for many, also became a means of spreading diseases, creating an even greater barrier to recovery. And yet, families who managed to eat a bowl or two of porridge found themselves facing another dilemma: the constant weakness that arose after consuming these contaminated foods. The feeling of despondency was widespread. What was consumed to satiate hunger became in fact a poison for the body. As the months passed, and the plague claimed new victims, peasants found themselves in a constant struggle against their own health. Moldy grain porridge was, for many, the only thing that kept them alive, but it was also responsible for making them even sicker. The history of these foods, and the choices made by peasants during the Black Death, is a grim portrait of how hunger and the need for survival can lead human beings to face the greatest horrors, accepting imminent death as part of the process. In the end, repurposed grain porridge was not just food, but a symbol of a time when human life had little value, and where hunger and disease dictated the rules of survival. The constant struggle between eating and dying became a daily reality for plague survivors, who were forced to choose between health and survival in a deadly game of sacrifices and tragedies. During the Black Death, one of the greatest fears for those trying to survive was not only the disease that spread rapidly among humans, but also the food that was increasingly difficult to find. Harvests were severely affected by the plague, not only because of the death of peasants, but also due to the direct impact the epidemic had on the soil, seeds, and plants. The lands that once provided an abundance of fresh fruits and vegetables were now impregnated with the remains of human and animal corpses, which made the land contaminated and the food grown on it even more dangerous. Imagine a village in the midst of the plague's chaos. The hills and fields that were once green, fertile, and prosperous are now covered by a dark, opaque layer of hopelessness. Fruit trees which once produced apples, pears, and other succulent fruits stand still, their leaves dry, and their fruit production erratic and often contaminated. The soil, which should be a source of nutrition, is now fertile ground for the spread of diseases, with the bodies of plague victims and dead animals left to decompose on the earth. The contact between contaminated soil and the plants growing there made vegetables and fruits extremely risky for consumption, and this fact often went unnoticed by hungry peasants. Initially, many villagers saw fruits and vegetables as a salvation, a possible way out of the growing hunger that threatened to further devastate the population. But what they didn't know was that these plants were absorbing the residues and toxins from the corpses that had been buried or left to rot in the field. The bodies of the dead, both human and animal, were devastatingly contaminating the soil. The plague, with its deadly bacterium, was not only killing people but also leaving an indelible mark on the land that nourished them. These corpses, human and animal, were a continuous source of contamination for the plants growing around them. As they decomposed, human and animal remains released toxic substances and pathogens into the soil. The soil then absorbed these residues, and everything cultivated there became at risk. The roots of the plants, which were in direct contact with the soil, absorbed these toxins and pathogens. The fruits and vegetables then became contaminated, and what should have been a source of nutrients and vitamins became a poison disguised as food. Peasants, in their struggle for survival, saw hope in fruits and vegetables. Harvests, though scarce, were still more accessible than meat, and much less risky to be seized or stolen. However, what seemed to be an opportunity for fresh and healthy food was in fact contributing to the spread of diseases, worsening the situation for those already at risk. The fruits that seemed innocent, apples, pears, grapes, were often moldy and rotten, with dark, moldy spots. Vegetables, like cabbages and carrots, were rotting as proper care for the land was lacking. But for the hungry, these foods were a temporary relief. Even if they were visibly damaged, they were the only type of food available for those who were already at their last gasp, unable to make choices. Peasants, in their desperation, had no choice but to consume what was within their reach. Many simply did not perceive the extent of the contamination that was happening beneath the surface of the food. Even if a fruit looked good on the outside, it could be infected with the same pathogens that had decimated their families. Plants absorbed toxins from the contaminated soil, and the effect on the human body was devastating. By consuming these fruits or vegetables, people ran the risk of ingesting the same pathogens that caused the plague, as well as fungi, toxins, and other bacteria that accelerated the process of human body deterioration. No matter how much these foods were used to combat hunger, they often brought with them a new series of diseases. Intestinal infections spread, accompanied by severe diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and vomiting. For peasants, these symptoms were constant, as there was no way to avoid consuming contaminated foods. Those who managed to survive the immediate effect of food poisoning found their defenses further weakened, becoming easy prey for the plague. Soil contamination directly affected the health of the population, who, in their struggle for survival, did not have the luxury of selecting safe foods. While cities and villages were devastated by the plague, many peasants saw in poisoned fruits and vegetables the only chance to stay alive. They did not understand the full extent of the risk they were taking. Without adequate knowledge about the impact of plague residues in the soil, the population made these decisions in a state of complete ignorance, believing that these foods could at least help them resist for a few more days. However, instead of alleviating hunger, these contaminated foods were only deepening the tragedy. Food scarcity extended to all aspects of life, but fruits and vegetables, which otherwise could have been a blessing, were now becoming one of the main sources of death and suffering. Furthermore, fruits and vegetables, being grown near homes, were more accessible and less likely to be properly stored, making it more difficult to identify that they were contaminated. Often, peasants picked what could be harvested and consumed it immediately, without worrying about the long-term consequences. Soil contamination affected the seeds and sprouts of plants, making harvests increasingly useless and risky. Even those few families who tried to cultivate new vegetables in clean fields saw their results frustrated. The seeds, often stored during the winter months, were infused with the same toxins that the corpses had left in the soil, which compromised even new harvests. The cycle seemed endless. Crops withered, food was consumed without question, and people died sooner than one might imagine. Although the plague was the main cause of mass death, what was happening on the land, soil contamination, the consumption of poisoned foods, was a final blow to those who were already fighting for their lives. They could barely distinguish between what was good to eat and what was destroying their bodies from within. The cumulative effect of ingesting contaminated fruits and vegetables was one of the many untold tragedies during the Black Death. As the sun set over the devastated fields, a sense of despair took over everyone. Families, who still had the strength to go out and look for a piece of food, could no longer trust even the fruits growing in their own garden. The soil, which was once a source of life, became a field of death, and the fruits and vegetables it produced were infected, becoming yet another trap for those who, in truth, sought only to survive. In those dark times, What remained as food was merely a reflection of the destruction the plague caused. The contamination of the fields and the land that sustained food left a trail of death that spread, not only from the plague itself, but from the slow and fatal poisoning of the very sources of life. Fruits and vegetables, which had once been symbols of abundance and nutrition, were now just another face of the tragedy, bearing the weight of an invisible curse that led those who consumed them to a silent death. During the Black Death, Europe faced such absolute chaos that almost all structures supporting daily life were affected. From the collapse of agriculture to the death of thousands of people, the crisis touched every aspect of life. But one of the greatest and most devastating effects of the plague, often forgotten or minimized, was water contamination. Water, an essential source for human survival, which should have been the vital liquid that quenched thirst, became one of the greatest instruments for the dissemination of the plague. Imagine yourself in a medieval city, where the sounds of screams and groans fill the streets. The plague is spreading relentlessly, rapidly killing those unlucky enough to come into contact with the disease agent. Houses are lifeless, and streets are full of corpses, with survivors trying to keep their distance from what seemed to be a divine scourge. But for those still struggling to live, there is something even more fundamental that threatens them: water. With the plague decimating the population, many of the water sources in towns and cities were in a terrible state. Clean springs and streams, which were once the most reliable water sources, were abandoned as bodies began to accumulate in the streets. The risk of water source contamination increased as the death toll rose. Corpses, both human and of animals infected by the plague, began to decompose near these vital sources. Thus, what was once a precious resource became a deadly trap, endangering the lives of the few survivors still struggling to survive. Water sources in medieval towns and cities, which used to be built simply, were often open and had no kind of filtering or purification system. Sewage ran freely through the streets, and the remains of dead bodies of plague victims were left to rot in the waters of rivers and springs. With the heat, decomposition accelerated, and the pathogens that caused the plague spread easily. In an era without any understanding of germs and bacteria, the water available was often the same water that spread the disease. People, in their desperation to survive, had no choice but to drink this contaminated water. The vicious cycle of death and contamination was simple. Whoever drank contaminated water likely became infected, and soon, being struck by the plague, became another victim to be buried in a mass grave or thrown into the streets. Water, which should have been a symbol of life, became a vehicle of death, spreading the plague from one city to another, from village to village, from house to house. For peasants and the poor, who could not afford a private well or travel far to find clean water, this situation was even more desperate. The water sources near villages or towns were all they had, and to survive, they had to be consumed. What seemed to be the last resort of survival became, in reality, the greatest threat to life. Much of the contaminated water was infested not only with plague germs, but also with other types of pathogens that caused severe intestinal diseases. Water served as the main vector for infections like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. In the worst cases, these types of infections caused death within days, worsening the situation for those already debilitated by the plague. Those who survived the plague for some time were frequently vulnerable to these secondary infections, which were equally lethal. People, unknowingly, were constantly contaminating themselves by consuming any available water. Even private wells, which might seem a safer option, were quickly becoming contaminated by the proximity of decomposing bodies. Sewage flowing through the streets also found its way into springs and wells, making the water even more dangerous. It was as if the city itself was turning into a broth of death, where water no longer represented life, but became an invisible killer, spreading disease everywhere. In some places, people tried, somehow, to purify the water. Boiling was a common attempt to eliminate bacteria and parasites, but for the most part, it was not effective against plague pathogens. This is because the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic plague, spread mainly through the bites of infected fleas found on rats that were also present near water sources. Even boiling could not neutralize the effects of infection, especially when the city's sanitation system was already compromised. In an even more desperate scenario, the consumption of contaminated water affected not only those already infected with the plague, but also those at risk of contracting the disease. Once sources were infected, everyone who drank from that water was at risk, and so an entire city could be decimated, one neighborhood after another, as contaminated water spread through the population. For those trying to stay out of the plague's reach, dirty and contaminated water became an additional obstacle to their struggle for survival. There was no escaping its presence, there was nowhere to run, and most of the time, drinking water from the source was the only way to quench thirst. Imagine the situation of a woman or man who, upon waking in the middle of an unbearably hot and suffocating day, realizes that the only available water source is contaminated with corpses. They need to drink, as they are thirsty, and without this water, death would be certain from starvation or dehydration. They might even try to purify the water by boiling, but the risk of contracting diseases is too great. This is a situation of absolute despair, where the choice between drinking and dying of thirst is an almost impossible decision. Throughout the villages and towns, rumors spread of people who had become prisoners of their own basic needs. Those who drank contaminated water soon fell ill, attacked by high fever, tremors, and severe body aches, symptoms of the plague spreading through the body. Agony was inevitable, and intense suffering spread rapidly among those who had consumed this water. For plague survivors, there was little time for reflection or regret. They found themselves in an endless cycle of contamination. Water, which should have been a vital resource for survival, was now draining life from everyone, becoming one of the disease's most terrible weapons. What should save lives was, in fact, accelerating death. Dirty and contaminated water became the ultimate irony of a time when, trying to avoid death from the plague, people found themselves in an even more tragic scenario. The water that could save them was, in fact, condemning them to death. The sad end of the story is that water, the most vital resource for human life, was completely out of reach for peasants and the poorest people during the Black Death. Drinking from contaminated sources not only meant staying alive a little longer, but also meant imminent death. And so, the plague spread. Contaminated water perpetuated the cycle of death, and those seeking to survive ended up being victims of one of human history's cruelest ironies. The struggle for life that ultimately turned into a means of death. During the Black Death, the inhabitants of medieval cities and towns faced one of the cruelest food scarcity crises in history. The end of harvests, the death of livestock, and the collapse of food supply systems pushed the population into a state of absolute despair. In a world where traditional meat sources failed, a desperate choice was made to consume dog and cat meat. These animals, normally considered companions and even protectors in homes, became for many one of the last sources of protein. However, the meat of these animals not only had a dubious taste, but also carried a fatal risk, as many were infected with the same diseases that decimated the human population. The consumption of dog and cat meat was not only an extreme survival measure, but also a direct path to the worsening of the crisis, with the spread of even more lethal diseases. Imagine yourself in a medieval city, where the once bustling streets are now deserted, with the plague at its worst. Markets are empty, warehouses looted, and the lack of meat is one of the greatest challenges faced by residents. People are starting to wither from hunger, their strength rapidly draining, while the fear of imminent death paralyzes them. In a world where meat was essential to sustain strength and physical resistance, the lack of this protein source becomes an even more terrifying threat. And it is in this scenario of absolute despair that dogs and cats, animals living in people's homes, enter history as one of the most controversial and desperate options for survival. Facing the collapse of livestock farming, with oxen, cows and sheep being killed by the plague, or sold at exorbitant prices, villagers found themselves forced to look at their own domestic animals. Dogs and cats, which until then were seen as family members or pets, began to be viewed with new eyes. For many, these animals came to represent a vital protein resource, even if the idea of sacrificing them for consumption was repulsive. Dog and cat meat, no matter how desperate a necessity, was far from an ideal solution. Firstly, the meat of these animals had a dubious taste. It was fibrous, dark, with a strong and, for many, unbearable taste. The flavor, far from being appreciated, was something people swallowed reluctantly, as the simple act of keeping their stomachs full seemed more important than the quality of the food. But for those with empty stomachs, the meat of any available animal could represent the difference between living and dying of hunger. However, the biggest problem with dog and cat meat was that these animals were frequently infected with diseases. Many were exposed to the same plague that killed the human population, as the bacterium Yersinia pestis, responsible for bubonic plague, spread easily among rats and other rodents, which in turn infected dogs and cats. Animals like dogs and cats were vulnerable to infection by plague-infected fleas, which meant they were not only vehicles for the disease, but also its victims. The meat of a dog or cat that died of plague was therefore contaminated with the same pathogens that were decimating humans. People who consumed the meat of these sick animals were in fact exposing themselves to the risk of ingesting even more lethal pathogens. By eating this contaminated meat, the human body became vulnerable not only to the plague, but also to a series of secondary bacterial infections. Furthermore, many of these animals were infested with internal parasites, such as worms and other microorganisms, which posed an additional health risk to those who consumed their meat. Those who ate this contaminated meat frequently suffered from food poisoning, diarrhea, severe intestinal cramps, and other symptoms associated with intoxication. And while families tried to survive on dog and cat meat, many could not escape the consequences. The meat of an infected dog not only carried the bacteria that caused the plague, but also other secondary diseases, such as leptospirosis and rabies, which were transmitted through consumption or contact with the meat of these animals. For a population already debilitated by hunger and disease, consuming meat from sick animals was, at best, a desperate measure. At worst, a slow death sentence, as those who ate contaminated meat became more susceptible to other infections, further weakening their immune system and making them more vulnerable to the plague. But what else was there to do? When the meat of cows, sheep and pigs disappeared or became inaccessible, the meat of dogs and cats became an inevitable alternative. Hunger was a relentless enemy, and many did not have the luxury of being selective. The act of consuming dog and cat meat represented the height of desperation, the last frontier between life and death. There was also the issue of slaughtering these animals. For many peasants, killing a dog or cat was an act of great sorrow, as they were often considered family members. It was painful to decide to sacrifice a pet or a working dog for food, but when survival was at stake, these decisions became inevitable. Families, in a gesture of extreme necessity, sacrificed their animals, cutting their meat, and in many cases, also using their bones and skins for various other purposes. The act of slaughtering a beloved animal and then consuming it was a desolate experience that left a deep mark on the people who did it. Villages closer to rural or isolated areas also faced similar problems, as dogs and cats, especially hunting dogs, were raised to protect herds and fields. When these animals were sacrificed, sadness and emotional burden were added to the already unbearable situation of death and despair. The meat, though vital for survival, represented the end of a life cycle, where the very concept of life and death blurred in the struggle for existence. Some families tried to add spices or other ingredients to dog and cat meat to improve its taste, but this rarely masked the strong and unpleasant taste of the meat. The effect of hunger was so great that for many the simple act of eating became a necessity that superseded any consideration of what was being consumed. Dog and cat meat, even with its unpleasant taste and obvious risks, was a temporary relief in a world where appetite was a constant struggle. As time passed, food alternatives dwindled, and dog and cat meat became one of the last options for those trying to resist what seemed to be an unending calamity. The villages that sustained themselves during the Black Death were those that, no matter how unbearable the circumstances, found some kind of resource in scarcity. Dog and cat meat, once traditional protein sources, disappeared, represented not only the last hope for survival, but one of the most tragic ironies of an era marked by death and loss. Finally, reflecting on these extreme choices, we see how the Black Death not only decimated human lives, but also transformed the very rules of eating, survival, and dignity. The sacrifice of dogs and cats, however painful, is just one example of the profound changes the crisis imposed on those who were still struggling to live. But this act of desperation was also a reflection of how far humanity can be pushed to its limits when confronted with hunger and death in its cruelest form. In the vastness of medieval Europe, hunger was a constant shadow that hung over villages and cities. Over the years, food supply was a constant struggle. Stocking food for winter, or in times of scarcity, was a common and vital practice for survival. But when the Black Death arrived and devastated the population, it not only brought disease but also a total collapse in food distribution systems. Many food resources stored in barns and pantries, which had once been reliable sources of survival, were now contaminated, moldy, or infested with parasites. However, in a moment of total desperation, when death seemed an inevitable certainty, the simple act of eating what was left, no matter how spoiled, became one of the only options for survivors. Imagine a small village, surrounded by fields devastated by the plague. The land, once fertile and full of life, now seems sterile, without any sign of a recent harvest. There is no more fresh meat, no new bread coming out of the oven, and last summer's fruits and vegetables are gone. The air is heavy with the smell of death, and the streets are deserted, except for the bodies that continue to be taken to mass graves. In the barns and food warehouses, what remained were the previous year's stocks, which had been carefully preserved to face winter food shortages. However, these stocks, which should have ensured survival, were, for the most part, in deplorable condition, moldy, infested with insects, worms, and rodents. These foods were now as contaminated as the air and water of the village. What was once a symbol of preparation and care for difficult times now became a risk. Stored seeds, which could have been used for future harvests, were full of mold, and cereals saved for winter became a broth of bacteria and fungi. But for the survivors who wandered through the villages, exhausted and hopeless, even these spoiled foods became a matter of life or death. The human instinct for survival is strong, and in a world where death was around every corner, the simple act of eating, regardless of the food's condition, became the only way to continue living, even if for just one more day. In the barns and food warehouses, the grains that had been carefully stored to withstand time and scarcity were infested with rats and worms. Mold covered the walls of the shelves and flour sacks, as if death itself was spreading over everything. Grains that were not completely rotten were still eaten, despite the smell of mold that spread in the air. For those who were already weak and hungry, the simple fact of being able to chew something seemed like a small victory. There was no option but to consume what was left, because the alternative, death by starvation, seemed more immediate and even more horrific. These moldy grains, although mostly unusable for any cultivation purpose, were boiled and turned into porridges or soups. However, these spoiled foods were not only unpleasant in taste, but were full of toxic substances. The mold-covering grains and cereals contained aflatoxins, highly poisonous substances that, when ingested, caused serious liver damage, in addition to further weakening the immune system of already debilitated survivors. In a hungry body, exhausted by famine, these toxins were rapidly absorbed, making people even more vulnerable to the plague and other diseases. In addition to moldy grains, reserves of dried and salted meat were also contaminated. Many of these foods had been stored during the summer and autumn months, but, with the lack of salt and rudimentary preservation methods, the meat began to rot. Nevertheless, the meat, even in decomposition, was still consumed. It was an essential supplement for those who were trying to stay alive, even if the consequences were fatal in the long run. Parasites present in these meats, such as worms and larvae, were another latent threat. Even after cooking, many of these parasites could still survive, causing intestinal diseases and further weakening the victims. But the worst of all was what happened when stored food was contaminated, not only by mold and parasites, but also by a direct infection of diseases. Rodent plagues, which spread everywhere due to the increased rat population, were also disease carriers. Rat feces contaminated food, and ingesting these foods became another way to spread the disease. When plague spread, hunger and diseases were no longer just a risk factor, they were inevitable. In the fields, the herbs and plants that were still available were often contaminated in some way, either by fungi or by the remains of corpses that had been abandoned in the fields. The land, laden with traces of the plague, made any attempt at cultivation a risk. But in many villages, people desperately tried to grow what they could, hoping that some fresh food could help alleviate hunger. However, these attempts frequently failed, as the land was saturated with pathogens and the seeds, often contaminated, did not germinate as expected. This scenario of total scarcity, where even what seemed safe was contaminated, increased the despair of survivors. Families often had no choice but to consume what remained of the stocks, even if that meant ingesting contaminated, moldy, and infested foods. For the weakest, especially children and the elderly, ingesting these deteriorated foods was another death sentence, but the alternative, death by hunger, seemed much more immediate. The practice of eating contaminated food was common among Black Death survivors, but it was not without consequences. Those who managed to survive the effects of ingesting these foods could still succumb to the plague, as the consumption of deteriorated foods weakened their immune system, making them more vulnerable to the disease. The long-term effects of these dietary practices were devastating, as intestinal diseases caused by ingesting contaminated food only worsened the situation, leaving victims even more fragile and unable to fight the plague. But the fact is that for those who were desperate to survive, the simple act of eating whatever it was represented a temporary victory against death. The human instinct for survival is powerful, and in a moment of despair, any food, no matter how contaminated or spoiled, seemed better than eating nothing. In those plague-stricken villages, appetite was no longer a choice, but a vital necessity. Eating the remaining food from stocks, even if poisoned or moldy, became a form of resilience, an act of resistance against an uncontrollable force that seemed to swallow everything and everyone around it. As the months passed and stocks ran out, the reality of what remained became clearer. Survival conditions were for many unbearable. Stored foods, now contaminated, could no longer guarantee the necessary resistance to withstand the plague or other diseases. Even so, those who still managed to survive these extreme conditions continued to fight, in a silent and desperate battle against an invisible enemy that surrounded them every day. In the end, what remained of food stocks was not only a matter of physical survival, but also of emotional and psychological resilience. In a world where death was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to claim another victim. In the medieval era, where life was marked by countless adversities, one of people's greatest concerns was water. In villages and cities, water from springs was often contaminated by sewage, food scraps, and even corpses. With the plague ravaging the population, and the constant fear of drinking water that could cause even more diseases, many people resorted to alcoholic beverages as a solution to this dilemma. Among these beverages, the most popular, accessible, and consumed was beer. Beer, with its alcohol content, was seen as a way to avoid ingesting contaminated water, a practical and, to some extent, safe solution for those fighting for survival. But, like many other food and survival alternatives during the Black Death, beer also carried a terrible risk. Often, it was made with contaminated grains, infused with mold, fungi, and parasites. What should have been a solution became a deadly trap, further aggravating the situation of peasants already weakened by the plague and hunger. Imagine yourself in a small medieval village, where the air is heavy with the smell of death, and the sound of bells tolling for another funeral echoes through the deserted street. The people who are still alive exhausted and debilitated by hunger, gather around taverns or in their homes, drinking what remains of their beer reserves. For them, this drink is not just a way to quench thirst, but a way to ensure they do not consume the impure water flowing from nearby springs, often contaminated with corpses and feces. In their minds, beer seems like a safe alternative. Furthermore, the alcohol in beer helps disinfect the drink, making it more reliable than the available water. Medieval beer was for the most part made from grains such as barley, wheat, or oats, which were fermented to create an alcoholic beverage. These grains, however, were often in deplorable condition. With the collapse of agriculture and the death of so many agricultural workers due to the plague, grain stocks were scarce. To make matters even worse, many of the grains that were still available were infested with mold and fungi, such as green mold, which developed in damp and warm conditions. Mold on barley seeds was a recurrent and invisible problem, but its consequences were devastating. When these contaminated grains were used to make beer, the mold and fungi were not eliminated by the fermentation process. Although alcohol has antimicrobial properties, it was not enough to kill all the pathogens present in the infested grains. Regular consumption of beer then not only offered a way to stay hydrated, but also provided a direct path to ingesting toxic substances and parasites. By drinking beer made from contaminated grains, people were, unknowingly, exposing themselves to even more serious diseases, such as food poisoning, intestinal infections, and even aflatoxin poisoning, substances produced by certain types of fungi that affect the liver. Furthermore, a beer was often stored in unsanitary conditions, in vats and barrels that were not properly cleaned. These barrels, over time, also became a fertile ground for the proliferation of bacteria and parasites, especially when in contact with contaminated liquids. The fact that beer was produced on a large scale to supply the population meant that quality was not always a priority. The goal was to ensure people had a drink available, not necessarily a safe one. And so, instead of offering a healthy and safe alternative to contaminated water, beer became one of the sources of disease that helped spread the tragedy of the plague even more rapidly. While people drank beer to escape water contamination, what they did not know was that they were, in fact, becoming more vulnerable to diseases. The effect of alcohol on the immune system, combined with the fungi and parasites present in the grains used in beer, further weakened the bodies of plague victims, making them more susceptible to infection. The combination of malnutrition, hunger, and consumption of a contaminated drink left peasants in a state of extreme fragility. The human body, already worn out by the lack of food and the presence of the plague, did not have enough resistance to fight these additional diseases. In many villages, beer was the most accessible drink for the vast majority of the population. Water consumption was seen as dangerous, and other drinks, like wine, were expensive and often inaccessible to the poor. Beer, on the other hand, was widely produced and consumed, being one of the only sources of hydration that peasants could afford. This constant and desperate consumption of contaminated beer fueled a vicious cycle. Instead of alleviating thirst and providing the necessary nutrients to keep the body strong, it simply aggravated the problem. People were becoming dependent on this unhealthy drink and, unknowingly, were consuming their own poison. No matter how much beer was made to quench thirst and provide a sense of comfort, it became a deadly drink as the ingestion of contaminated food and drink spread. The alcohol not only failed to eliminate the pathogens present in moldy grains, but also weakened people's immune systems, as they were already fighting the plague and hunger. As if the plague epidemic were not enough, intestinal infections caused by ingesting contaminated food and infected beer made the situation even more desperate. Taverns, once places of social gathering and rest, now became places where drink did not bring joy, but a temporary relief from constant suffering. People who could still afford a mug of beer were in fact buying a ticket to their own destruction. There was no longer pleasure in consuming the drink. It was a desperate attempt at survival. The taste of beer, already bitter because of the mold and fungi, seemed the only remedy for a population cornered by the plague and hunger. And for women and children, who also drank beer, the consequences were equally tragic. Although adults could, somehow, endure the effect of alcohol, younger individuals, whose bodies were more fragile and vulnerable, were subject to an even greater risk of intoxication. Contaminated beer, therefore, was not only a threat to the adult men who consumed it, but also to those at risk of dying more quickly due to the consumption of unhealthy food and drink. The paradox of beer during the Black Death is what makes it one of the greatest ironies of this tragedy. A drink that theoretically should have been a solution for contaminated water ended up becoming one of the most silent and cruel sources of death and suffering. Peasants, already exhausted, had no choice but to drink what was available. Beer, instead of offering relief, perpetuated the cycle of disease and death, becoming yet another reminder of human helplessness in the face of a calamity of unimaginable proportions. As the Black Death continued its relentless march, beer that was once seen as a simple drink of the people transformed into yet another source of cruel and merciless death. Paradoxically, what should have been a solution, an alternative to dirty water, was in fact another contributing factor to the spread of disease and to the suffering of those desperately trying to survive in a world that already seemed to have been consumed by death. In the desperate struggle for survival during the Black Death, one of the greatest threats was not only the plague itself, but also the limited and frequently contaminated food resources. Food scarcity forced peasants and city dwellers to make extreme and dangerous decisions to ensure that what little food remained could be consumed, even in terrible condition. Many foods had been stored for months or even years, but were now deteriorated, infested with mold, parasites, or irreversibly rotting. The fear of hunger, which already plagued those who were still alive, led people to risk extremely perilous eating practices, such as using herbs and chemical substances to try and salvage rotten food. These preservation attempts, however, often resulted in an even more tragic fate. The foods supposedly saved with these substances became even more toxic, poisoning those who depended on them for survival. Imagine living in a small village at the height of the Black Death, where death is everywhere. The air is heavy with a pungent smell of decomposition, and the streets are empty, except for those few survivors who wander in search of food. The death of farm animals, such as oxen, cows, and pigs, made meat scarce, and when available, it was often in an advanced state of putrefaction. Grains, vegetables, and fruits were also infested with mold or rotting, but with the collapse of agriculture and the scarcity of any food, the population found itself facing a cruel dilemma: consume what was left or starve to death. In a scenario of total despair, people began to use everything at their disposal to save food. Herbs and plants that could be used to mask the taste or smell of deteriorated food became a quick solution. Certain herbs were mixed with food in an attempt to disguise mold and decomposition, making meals seem more appetizing, or at least less repulsive. But these herbs did not always have the function of preserving, and some of them were even toxic. What initially seemed like a good idea to aid survival ended up becoming another deadly risk. Plants like belladonna, poisonous ivy, and jimson weed were common in popular food preservation practices. These plants, which in small quantities were used for various medicinal purposes, had highly poisonous properties, capable of causing a series of harmful effects on the human body, such as hallucinations, paralysis, and even death. However, in times of extreme need, people resorted to these substances without realizing the risks they were taking. The use of such substances, although understood by some as a way to keep food good for longer, was actually making the food even more dangerous. Mixing these plants with rotten food resulted in a fatal combination that accelerated death instead of preventing hunger. In addition to herbs, another common practice was the use of chemical substances that, in an attempt to preserve food, ended up making the food even more toxic. The use of salt and vinegar, although common for preserving meats and other food products, was not enough to combat the bacteria and fungi that proliferated in food. Instead, people resorted to mixtures of chemical substances that were not only ineffective, but when consumed were extremely harmful to health. Many of these substances, such as sulfur, mercury, and lead, were improperly used in an attempt to cure or preserve meat, unaware that these practices were worsening the situation. These heavy metals, known for their poisonous properties, were ingested by those seeking to survive, further aggravating the situation. Besides chemical substances, there was also the practice of using salt in excessive quantities. In a world where meat was deteriorating rapidly, excess salt was considered a form of preservation, as it helped slow decomposition. However, this preservation technique was often not effective in preventing the growth of bacteria and fungi, and the consumption of excessively salted foods caused severe health problems, such as dehydration, fluid retention, and kidney failure. In a population already weakened by hunger, these additional health problems only accelerated the death process. The effects of inadequate preservation practices were visible throughout the community. Those who consumed foods treated with these toxic substances quickly began to show signs of poisoning. The first manifestation was a general feeling of malaise, followed by severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. For many, these symptoms were more than just discomfort, they were a prelude to death. The combination of food poisoning and the weakening of the body by hunger left peasants and city dwellers even more vulnerable to the plague. Poisoning by toxic substances made survivors more susceptible to infections, further diminishing their chances of recovery. But the most tragic thing of all was that people didn't know what was happening. They were taking desperate measures to save food and stay alive, but without knowledge of the consequences of these practices. The concept of germs and bacteria was unknown at the time, and notions of hygiene and food safety were practically non-existent. This meant that while they were trying to save their lives with what they had, they were often, in fact, taking substances that were slowly killing them. Hopelessness took over the villages. Families watched their loved ones suffer and die, largely due to the consumption of these contaminated foods. Often, the only option was to continue eating what was left, unaware that these preservation practices were only exacerbating the suffering. The very act of eating, which should have been a way to resist death, turned into a death sentence for many. These practices also reflected the lack of resources and knowledge of the populations of the time. The fear of hunger and the need to keep the body fed in such difficult times were stronger than any precaution against the risks of poisoning. What remained was a vicious cycle of desperate attempts to ensure survival, which ultimately turned into an even greater tragedy. Eating moldy or poisoned food with toxic substances not only prolonged physical suffering, but also accelerated the cycle of death caused by the plague. The bitter lesson from all this is that in times of despair, decisions made with good intentions can have disastrous consequences. Those who tried to preserve their food to ensure survival found themselves instead putting their lives at risk. The use of toxic substances, both natural and chemical, to preserve deteriorated food was one of the most tragic ironies of the Black Death. What should have been protection against hunger became one of the greatest causes of suffering and death. The fear of death from the plague mingled with the fear of death from poisoning, creating a scenario of indescribable anguish where even the act of eating, something essential for life, became a deadly threat. These 5 foods, and the other worse ones you will discover throughout this narration, are not just symbols of a dark era, but also a reflection of what happens when human necessity transcends all boundaries of health and sanity. As you will see, Black Death survivors were constantly confronted with impossible choices, and every bite they took could be their last. In a world where human life had little value, eating what was available was the only way to gain a little more time to live. And so, amidst so many tragedies and desperate choices, Black Death survivors faced not only death from disease, but also the slow and silent death brought by hunger and contaminated food. The struggle for survival turned into a deadly game, where even the simplest act of eating became a sentence of life or death. What remained of humanity, in the end, was a reflection of the deepest adversities faced. But the story of the Black Death does not end here. The next page of this dark narrative reveals even more unimaginable horrors and sacrifices made in the name of survival. Prepare for the next journey, where we will explore another terrifying chapter of this era of despair. Don't miss the next story, where we will reveal the last efforts to escape the abyss and the sacrifices made to ensure a thread of hope. Until then, stay alert, because what's coming is even more surprising.